I want to not flippantly suggest some answers today to what we've been seeing going on in our world. They're complex problems. The answers, there are some, and we're going to look at that today. And to begin that, I'm going to ask that you open your Bibles to the Gospel of Matthew. We're going to be looking at the 12th chapter of Matthew, and particularly beginning with verse 22. And I'm going to read a few of those verses. I'll stop around verse 25. So, chapter 12, 22, we begin. It's for those folks that have been in church a while, it's a story, it's an encounter, and it's some accusations being made about Jesus, and it's his response to some of those accusations. So some of these words may sound familiar to some of you. So let me begin. They brought to Jesus a man possessed by a demon who was both blind and mute, and he cured him, so that one who had been mute could speak and see. Can this be the son of David? But when the Pharisees heard it, they said, it's only Beelzebul, the ruler of the demons, that this fellow cast out the demons. It's by some evil power that they're saying Jesus is doing this. Verse 25, he knew what they were thinking and said to them, every kingdom divided against itself is laid waste, and no city or house divided, we've heard this before, no city or house divided against itself will stand. May God bless the reading and the hearing of God's holy word. When I began worship, when I first stood up this morning, I asked some questions about relevancy, or at least I suggested that we wanted to be relevant as a church, as a community, and to be relevant in not really, didn't really mean in a flippant way, but to check in on your smartphones to let people know where you were. Because it's the way that a growing number of people are communicating. So I want to ask a question to start with. It's sort of a rhetorical question. I'm going to offer some answers to you, and that is this. Do you feel your life is relevant? I want that to sink in for a minute, because I think the knee-jerk reaction is, of course my life's relevant. But I want to dig into that today, because the answer is really important, because a relevant life creates a relevant church. So this is the point. If I were sitting where you are, I'd go, what is he talking about now, right? You're about to lose me. You're getting into this philosophical thing about relevance. Well, relevant lives are connected lives. And here's what I mean. If you look up the definition to relevant, it says the quality of being closely and appropriately connected. Another way to think about that is a church is relevant when it's connected to God's activity, healing activity in the world. I think I don't need to tell you this, because it's one of these issues that's so in front of us today. But our world has a growing dysfunction, doesn't it? You see it. All you have to do is just live a few more weeks, a few more months, and something else will come along the way. And we go, wow, something's happening in the world, and we don't know how to explain it or talk about it. But I'm going to give you a word today to kind of frame in this idea of a dysfunctional reality that's making its way around us. And here's the word. It's hypocrisy. Now, before you jump into that word with you say, oh, we all know this. Yeah, there's a lot of hypocrisy. And before you turn that into the classic, either a political argument or a religious argument about hypocrisy, I want to look at that word. The Greek word for sincerity, or for sincere, actually means without hypocrisy. So you want to be sincere, it means you're without, you're out with hypocrisy. You're not play acting. You're not wearing some kind of a mask. And you see this idea in Romans in the 12th chapter. I'm not going to show that on the screen today, but it talks about love being sincere. That means it's It's fully presented. It's not pretending. So I think the problem in our lives today and in our world is we can present part of ourselves out to the world while denying another more important component inside. That's another way of thinking about hypocrisy. That's that kind of, we'll show some of ourselves to some folks, but a lot of it we hold deep within. And I think the problem that this creates from a biblical point of view is that we human beings, we tend to live these sort of a disunity in ourselves for who we are. You're thinking about that. If you're putting one thing out there and yet there's something else inside of you, it creates this imbalance in ourselves. I guess another way to think about it is we tend to split off parts of ourselves. And I've talked about this many times in worship, that we compartmentalize our spiritual selves. Maybe over here, maybe on Sunday, maybe right now, you're fully engaged, I hope, in your spiritual self, but we'll compartmentalize the rest of the world or a material being or what we're doing after worship today and next week. It's over here. It's in another little area. It's in another little compartment of our lives. And that's another way of thinking about being hypocritical. It's this two parts. And it's the part that Jesus begins to think about when he says, a house divided against itself will not what? Won't stand. He's saying there's something about pulling ourselves apart in some way. Entities or human beings or any power that seems to pull itself apart internally is bound for destruction. So, a house divided against itself will not stand. When you hear these words, what comes to mind? Right off the bat. Politics, Lincoln, yeah, because we think Lincoln came up with that phrase. Actually, it was Jesus, and Lincoln tweaked on it a bit. For me, when I think about a house divided against itself, you know me, I'm visual. So I'm immediately, I see a house. When I said that, did anybody see a house in their mind's eye? I see a house, and I see it splitting apart. I think a house divided against itself can't stand. I think of this house breaking apart, tearing in two. Maybe the foundation has split, and it's beginning to fall apart. I think when Jesus is using this teaching expression, it's an analogy for life. He was responding to some accusations, but he's talking about, here's an analogy for life in the kingdom of God. Here's how the world works. I don't think he was talking about a literal house. He was talking about a spiritual house. He was talking about the part inside, an internal fight, an internal struggle that you might be waging against yourself. Two parts. What is happening in our world today? I think people want to know the answer to that. What's happening in our world today? I think we all sense this growing tension and actions that look like the proverbial house divided, right? A house divided. That Jesus says, this thing that's going on is going to fall into ruin. I'd like to offer some perspective on that question. I'm going to refer to the question a few times today. What's happening in our world today? What's happening in our culture today? I believe what you and I are experiencing right now is a house divided, which is starting to show signs of tearing. I want to give you just a simple example. Today, many people don't know how to, if you're filling out a form, it wants you sometimes to declare your religious affiliation, right? Check the box or write it in, what you are. And many people today are very confused. They don't know what to do with the question anymore because they'll say, I'm spiritual but not religious. How many people have heard that? I'm spiritual but not religious. Interesting. It's meaning that they sense some part of spirituality, and they've got that thing going on, but there's a divide with sort of institutional religion. It's sort of pushed apart a bit, so they kind of live a bit separated from the institution of the church. We've used this statistic before, but it knocks me out when I see it. It also confirms this idea of a fracturing going on. 9 out of 10 people in 2017 say they believe in God. 9 out of 10 people in the U.S. say, I believe in God. Wonderful. 3 out of 10, 30%, actually do what you're doing today. They actually take their belief and act on it by coming to a communal worship setting like this. I think the question and how people answer it today shows we tend to divide some of our spiritual life, some of who we are, from our daily physical life. So are you religious or are you spiritual? Jesus said a house divided won't stand. And the analogy, it works out for ourselves too. And his statement can be so appropriate today when I think about it, meaning we can stand, thrive, or we can eventually divide and fracture into maybe 2 parts, 3 parts, 4 parts, on and on and on. We really do have a tendency, and before you reject this as I say it, I think we do have a tendency to separate our body and our souls. You know, that's that spiritual essence of who we are. Spiritual, but not religious. I'm not even sure I know what that means, really. I hear people say it. I'm not really sure I know what it means. Does it mean a part of themselves? A part of who they are is spiritual and the other part not? How much? How much is the spiritual part? How much is not? And where does it start? Where does it stop? Is it a percentage? I think there's consequences. We don't pay attention to the mix, the blend of those things, the whole. And I think how that works out in my own life, I guess the way I start to try to understand what the statement means, I'm a bit divided myself, you know, between my physical being and my spiritual presence. You know, in my head, I'm still young, I'm active, I'm able to leap small children in a single bound, okay? In my head, I can do that, right? But in my body, it's another story. I may feel in my head, in my spirit, like I'm 25, but my body says, no, you're not. You're 60. And if you try to do those crazy things that you did when you were 25, you're going to hurt yourself. And of course, I have. Hence, the x-rays, right? I have all the scars to show it. So when we live these two distinctions, when I live those two distinctions, I get in trouble, right? I get over my head, and I engage in activities I think I can do, and then I feel really bad, both physically and I feel bad spiritually, because I'm like, I'm not who I used to be, and I can't do it. I hurt in my body, and then I hurt in my spirit, because I thought I could do something more. Jesus said splitting of ourselves like this is like, his analogy, God against God. It's impossible. It doesn't work. And it doesn't work for us either. We can't split ourselves off against ourselves, and we also can't split ourselves off against God. So I think what's happened here is this world of technology has helped us create these sort of, I think they're artificial divisions, because it's easy now today to see yourself as either spirit or body, spiritual and material. And here's how this works for me. You know, we have x-rays and we have rockets, right? X-rays and rockets. And here's how this works. Thinking that I'm still 25, I did things in later years that I should never have done. So, and I have a companion here. We had the same surgery. So I have a herniated disc in my neck, and I had to have surgery my very first year here at Markham Woods. So I have a titanium plate, and so they took this x-ray. So x-rays, they're interesting, aren't they? They took an MRI of my head, and first it provides absolutely to my family, there is a brain in there. Okay, in case you're wondering, I have absolute documented proof there's a brain in there. But also, it brings up that question, doesn't it? Because what used to be a mystery of our soul is turned into black and white photos that only reveal bone, right? Maybe some soft tissue, but mostly what it reveals is bone. So we say, where's the spirit? Like I asked the kids today, where's my spirit? You know, it's, remember the old Wendy's commercial, where's the beef? You got to be old enough to get that. Sorry, guys. But go look it up. Go look up in some historic archive about where's the beef. So the deal about where's the beef is you could, hey, where's the tangible stuff? Well, we can see the outside tangible stuff. We can see the bone stuff. But where's the soul? Where is it? We see the material world, literally and figuratively, but what about the rest of us? And I think it goes along. I'll give you a second example, is the rocket era. When we started shooting rockets through the clouds, something happened to us as a human race, because again, there was a mystery to the clouds. The mystery was who lived there? God. Who else? Angels. What else was there? Heaven. Did somebody say heaven? Okay, you get the award today. So angels, God, heaven, or somewhere up there, right? And then when we shot rockets through the clouds, guess who they didn't see? Angels, God, and heaven. And so it begins to break that myth. And so we start doubting this whole thing. Really, what are we? Where is the spirit? Where are spiritual things? We begin to separate, don't we? Physical from the spiritual reality. And it means that we've begun to be a fragmented people. The unity which God created in us is artificially separated into spiritual stuff and material, physical stuff. The soul and the body. And that also, like my head and my body, it gets us over our heads because we're missing something very important to functioning as human beings in this world. We can't pull out percentages. Which parts of us are what? Spiritual or physical. It doesn't work that way. I think it's like we have tithe faith. Anybody come from originally, this church is made up of lots of folks. It's a Presbyterian church, but we have Baptists, Episcopalians, Lutherans, Pentecostals. We have everybody here. So anybody come from one of those churches early on where you had to do the tithe? The tithe is 10%. Yeah, they would really push on the tithe. You had to give 10% of whatever God's given you, and you give that over to the church. So I think we have this sense of a tithe faith. Pastors love to preach on tithing. I don't ever preach on tithing, and you're about to find out why. They preach on tithing because we all know, some of the finance people in this building right now know, if everybody in the church gave 10%, we'd be able to repaint this place, new carpet, amazing things. We'd have ministries we could only imagine. So pastors preach on it because they'd love to see it happen. But there's a bit of a flaw in seeing yourself, your physical self, and your spiritual self like that. It's like, 10% in tithing faith is 10% of myself is the spiritual part, and I'll give all that to God, all 10%. But the 90% left over, the material part, well, that's me, that's my body, that's my stuff, it's what I do. And we sort of separate those, we split those things out as if they're two separate items. And here's the thing, God doesn't see any of us that way. Do you think God looks at us and sees body and spirit? I don't think God looks at us that way. I think God looks at us as a whole creation. If God made our bodies and breathed into us the spirit, they're both coming from God. Therefore, they're the same thing. We are a whole. I heard somebody describe this as we are besouled bodies, right? Besouled bodies. We're bodies and souls. Besouled. We're all one. Now, when you grab hold of that idea, this thought of spiritual self, a separator up against material existence, doesn't make any sense at all. It's a conflict in living. And I don't think we all have this awareness, but there's no such thing as a life without body, and there's no such thing as a life without spirit. Even those children understood that when I showed them the x-ray. They knew there's something more than just skin and bones. However, I think there's a growing tendency in our world to embrace aspects of life apart from our spiritual lives. They have this new way of, I don't know who invented this, and I hope I never meet them, but the body mass index, BMI, you know what that is? It's a lovely little formula where they get to tell us how much is lean muscle mass and how much is fat. Just what I want to know, right? BMI, body mass index. What if there were an SMI index, a spiritual mass index? Whoa. What if there was a way to see what percentage in ourselves and who we are is made up of the spiritual aspects and how much is made up of the material aspects? What would it show? If we could test out, would it show that tithe faith? Would it show 10% spirituality and 90% materiality, or dealing with material world? Maybe it would show 20-80, right? 20%. Maybe the disciples were 50-50, right? They're 50% spirituality and 50% body. I think what's happening to us is not new, but you're seeing signs of it, is a divided self where it should have been a whole. Body, worldly stuff, and soul, spiritual existence. Physical existence, spiritual existence. I read a quote that I thought really captured what's going on in the world today and might help us explain some of what we see. It's Neil Donald Walsh. He said, the world is starving for a new spiritual truth, a truth that works in sustaining life, not a truth that brings life to the end. If we try to pull these parts of ourselves, spread them, compartmentalize, I think that's not a truth that sustains. Jesus said it doesn't work that way. We're created to be a whole, a complete person, fully spirit, fully body, just like Jesus. Do you ever think about that? They refer to Jesus often as the second Adam. He came as the second Adam, only he didn't turn away from God. Fully human, fully spirit, fully integrated. What happened to that unity? We're starting to split apart, aren't we? We've become a house divided. What's happening in our culture? What do you see in the world today? I think it's this idea of compartmentalization. And it's led us to brokenness, breaking away spiritual selves from spiritual selves. And I want to close with one more illustration that for me really works. It's like we've built walls of separation inside of ourselves. Not that we aren't spiritual. We are that. But we have this internal separation between that of the spirit and that of our bodily existence. And we keep those things divided, separated. And I'm going to suggest that that's not natural. It's not the way God created us to live. Anybody been to the beach lately and seen that, some parts of the beach have seawalls? And seawalls are really important. Seawalls, but they're not natural, are they? What's the natural existence of the shoreline? It's the ocean interacting with the beach, right? Sand dunes and waves. And sometimes the sand dunes build up and then storms come along and wash them away. And then they build back up. It's a natural flow. It's a natural connection. There's no division there. It just kind of moves in and out, in and out, in and out until we come along and we want to build a house because we have property on the ocean. Got to protect your property, right? So what do? We put up an artificial barrier, put up a seawall. Isn't it interesting? We want to divide what is nature working out there and what's our stuff, our material possessions. And so we put those seawalls up because we have an investment, right? And then what happens when the storms come along? What was natural, a natural ebb and flow, now has an artificial barrier. And I don't know if you saw it on Irma. There was a house in St. Augustine. They televised it being eroded out. The foundation started to break apart. Half the house fell into the ocean. Did you see it? Anybody see it on TV? Amazing. Amazing. It split and fell off. I think if I want to offer you a way of thinking about what's happening today, that would be a good illustration. That we build our lives on a material world, our bodily existence, without full engagement of the spiritual. We put a barrier up between our heart Christ home and our physical lives. And that's unnatural, and it's artificial, and it leads to what Jesus was talking about, a house divided that falls off into the ocean. So what's happening to us in 2017? I think it's actions without a spiritual connection that leads to hypocritical lives that are moving into irrelevancy. And that sounds heavy. But there is hope. And if you'd like to know where that hope can be found, you'll have to come back next week. Let's pray.